free will in a meaningful sense is having a degree of control and agency, and that is always a matter of degree. It's not you have it or you don't, right?
Well, suppose, for example, we had an experiment, or rather some kind of finding, whereby some scientist has developed the technology to predict with 100% certainty. They scan somebody's brain, they track every single position of every atom in the brain and which direction neurons are firing and all of this kind of thing. And they're able, with some computer program, to predict with 100% accuracy exactly what a human being will do over the next 5 minutes. And every time they run it, it predicts it with 100% accuracy. Is this the kind of thing that would make you skeptical that people are free?
I think that thought is always quite scary to people, isn't it? We don't like to think we're that predictable, but predictability is, in a sense, a bit of a red herring there. It's a bit like the idea, there's a old theological argument that if God knows what you're going to do before you've even done it, then how can your actions be free, right? Because the idea here seems to be that if it's predictable, it's somehow, fixed in the wrong kind of way. But sometimes I make predictable free choices all the time, right? So if you see me go in to order a coffee and you know what kind of coffee I like, I don't literally order the same one every time, but you'll probably be able to predict what I'm going to order. You're certainly going to predict I'm not going to order a caramel latte grande maximo, whatever it's called. That's very, very predictable. It's entirely predictable. But why does that mean it's not free? In fact, the reason it's free is because Hume argued that it's the predictability which shows you it's free, if you like. That it's because my choices are driven by my desires, my personality, and these things have a meaningful stability. That's what makes the choice of the coffee meaningful, and that in turn is what makes it somewhat predictable. So I don't think we should get too sort of concerned that predictability is in itself the big threat to free will.
Peter, do you agree with Julian on this? If we have this computer that can predict, I could write down on a bit of paper right now every word that you're about to say in answer to this question. And once you've said it, I turned it around and said I predicted it with 100% accuracy. Would that be troubling to you?
It would be a little disconcerting. I agree. But I agree more with Julian that predictability and freedom don't have a particularly antagonistic relationship. The coffee example, I accept. I think the sorts of things that are scientifically in principle showable that would really be destabilizing or undermining of free will would be work on the mechanics that showed that the kind of belief-desire interaction that on the milder conceptions of free choice is what has to underlie a free behavior. You want this, you believe this action makes sense in terms of your beliefs and your desires, so you do that. If that's the model of an unconstrained reasonable free choice, if it turns out that lots of what actually generates our behavior is quite different from that, and the thing that we think of as the belief desire story that might be told is a kind of confabulated rationalization, we're just storytelling when we engage in those sorts of interpretations. If that's showable, then I'm bothered. As we're talking here, I'm remembering an experiment I read about years ago. I don't know if this has been followed up. I think it's called the pantyhose experiment. This was from some decades ago, where the idea was there are certain kinds of predictability in people's product choices. If you line things up on a table, I think it's a right-hand preference or something like that. People reliably go for a particular, the object in a particular part of the display. And you can do an experiment where the 4 items in the display are physically identical. They'll go for a particular one pretty reliably, and you ask them why, and they'll cook up a story. They'll find it, say, I thought that one just had a nicer texture, or it just the particular color appealed to me, even though the experimenter is quite confident that there's no physical difference between these things. So that's a situation where there's a disconnect between the rationalizing story that the person has in their mind, either before the fact or after the fact, or both, and the mechanics behind the actual thing they did. Now, if there was tons of that, if that was something that was all over human action, where it's not predictability per se, it's the fact that what predicts the choice is something that's far outside of what looks like the kind of rationalizing belief desire based story. If that was all over the place, I would be more than disconcerted. I think that really would be troubling.
But as scientists, we see self-report as notoriously unreliable. Like as a neuroscientist, I like including self-report variables in my experiments, often because I find it fascinating how they don't necessarily line up with how confidence doesn't necessarily line up with action, and you get these lovely divergences. And yes, we do create narratives after the fact. And there is a reason why self-report measures deviate from actual mapping of neural and physiological measures. And you see that more for self-related concepts than you do for extraceptive. So we have the extraceptive system, which is how to navigate and understand the world. We have the intraceptive system, which is how to understand ourselves and our internal signals. And you can do experiments where you look at people's ability to be confident that they've seen, felt, heard an extraceptive signal, and that nicely corresponds to confidence. You get a nice confidence accuracy correspondence. But with intraceptive signals about what's happening in ourselves, you get this massive divergence between confidence and accuracy for self-related signals. And that's potentially because there's been a divergence in our extraceptive signals have helped us navigate the world, whereas we're constantly bombarded by signals in our body to our brains all the time, and we don't necessarily want to be aware of them, influenced by them, unless they've reached a threshold of hunger and other types of homeostatic needs. So you do get this potential divergence between the intraceptive signal and conscious access.
Is my recollection of that older experiment with the displays, is that accurate?
I've heard that vague one, which is absolutely, people will narrate things afterwards. Yeah.
But what I want to say about that was that, sure, we do confabulate, we do create these stories, absolutely, and we underestimate how much of our choices are like that. But the thing about these experiments, right, is that people go, oh my God, this is extraordinary, just as it is to the right. These experiments are usually around things which are like trivial or unimportant or marginal, right?
I agree.
So, even the Libet thing, press a button for no good reason whatsoever at any time, right? How and that experiment is meant to tell you about whether you have free will, about the person you choose to have your children with, or stuff like that. Pantyhose. So people will choose the pantyhose to the right rather than this. Do people go into the shops and meaning to buy pantyhose and walk out with socks because the display? No, they don't, right? So I think that so often the problem here, one of the problems here, is that it's very, very easy to show that we're swayable and persuadable by things we're not aware of. But the experiments tend to be on trivial things, on more important things. So let's take something more serious, voting, right? I think there is some evidence that the order of the candidates on the ballot paper has a statistically significant effect on how many votes they have. But that does not mean that 90% of people who go in there know who they want to vote for, they find the candidate and they cross it. What's happening is the sort of like 10% of people who are just undecided or not very thoughtful go in, and a percentage of them are influenced by the position on the ballot paper, and if you statistically analyse it, that turns out to be significant. It doesn't tell you that most people going in to vote aren't voting for someone who they've chosen to vote for because that candidate they believe most aligns with their values. So, generalising from these very, very contrived laboratory experiments to the big important decisions on life is a huge leap.
As an experimentalist, I completely agree with that. We need to have these things in the lab in order to study them, but I absolutely believe they're contrived as well. And we can exercise, there's different circuitry that underlies this automatic type processing and more controlled processing, like the prefrontal cortex, that exercises inhibitory control over these more automatic signals. So absolutely.
And I guess it's hard to investigate consequential choices in an experiment because you don't want too much to depend on the downstream consequences of what you do in an experiment.
Yeah, we're limited.
Yeah.
This kind of insight shows us, the idea that there's a somewhat statistically reliable indicator of voting based on the order of candidates on a form. And this isn't enough to determine that somebody will always vote for the first person, but it's one of a great deal of influencing factors. But let's say we just started to consider what the other influencing factors are. So the fact that the first name on the ballot, that's not enough to determine somebody voting, but it has a small influence in that direction. So why someone who does tick that name, why else might they have ticked that name? Well, maybe because of their upbringing and the kind of political culture that they're born into. They have no control over that. That's quite a big influence over who they vote over. Maybe they watched a television debate and someone did particularly well. And maybe like they didn't control whether the TV was on or not. They walked home and the show happened to be on. Maybe their parents were watching it or something like this, you know. If you consider all of these kinds of factors, and we discovered that the majority or even all of the factors, when you consider all of them, are the kinds of things like the order of the ballot that we just don't have control over. But it turns out that it's things of that kind which overall do in fact determine ultimately why the person ticked that box. It might be lots of different factors, but if we're equally not in control of any of those factors, can we really say that we're in control of who we tick?
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.